ourselves and about the people around us. And we're all unreliable narrators. It's human nature, I mean, literally human nature, to create stories. Not just tell them, but constantly spin them in our mind to connect events that may or may not actually be connected. Evolution made us what science writer Michael Shermer calls pattern-seeking primates. As a species, we survived because we heard the rustling in the grass and connected it to the possibility of a threat to us. Our ancestors are the ones whose minds could spin out that story of the movement in the grass and connect it to a tiger that might come and eat us. 9 out of 10 times we might have been wrong, but the 10th time really mattered. So just because we see the patterns doesn't mean they're actually there. And so nature also made us unreliable narrators. I mean, it made us into sports fans convinced our team lost the game because we washed our lucky socks. I mean, look, evolution's real, but it's kind of weird sometimes. And if it were only a question of dirty socks on game day, it wouldn't be a big deal, but it isn't just that. This pattern seeking leads us to draw all kinds of connections that may not actually exist, to screen our view of the world through too narrow or too few lenses. A simple example is the moment of rage you feel, well, at least I feel, at the inconsiderate idiot who cuts you off in traffic. From that single incident, in a matter of seconds, you write a whole story about who that person is and why he would do that to you. To you, of course, because we're always at the center of our own stories. That driver will go on his way and he'll probably be forgotten, but we also fill in backstories for people who don't literally drive out of our lives. I'm a lawyer and I see it a lot in my legal practice. Clients who take a single incident and blow it up into the explanation for everything the other person does, or clients who are sure they know what is motivating the other person, why they do everything they do, and it's always to get at them. Absolute certainty that they know why the other person didn't return a phone call, didn't write a check on time, wrote that one line in that one email. And once they've settled on that narrative, it's easy to settle into a story that casts the other person as the villain and themselves as hero or victim or both. Think of the single stories Chimamanda Adichie warns against. A poor family that has that single characteristic in a young girl's mind. A young woman who comes from Africa must listen to tribal music, and how could she speak English? Without ever thinking about it, we constantly assign a predominant feature to the people we see, or even people we never meet, and build stories around that single strand of their story. So jock, nerd, Christian, atheist, lawyer, cop, liberal, Trump voter, doctor, trans, Black, Asian, Latino, angry, introvert, extrovert. Give us a filter, and we will unconsciously use that to explain or justify everything a person does. Philosopher Nassim Nicholas Taleb describes this instinctive need to bind A to B, to weave separate facts together with some sort of explanation, as the narrative fallacy. And look, it's probably unavoidable to some extent, because our brains need narrative to make sense of the world. We are constantly writing stories because we couldn't function without them. And that's all fine, until we forget the stories we're concocting from moment to moment are just our stories. And they may or may not be true and accurate. They are almost certainly flawed in some way. I mean, if they're not outright false, then they are incomplete. They lack perspectives. But we tell ourselves these flawed stories because they're simple. And in the words of writer Ariel Dome, we feel more comfortable with coherent stories than we do with experiencing the world as it really is, which a lot of the time is random, incoherent, and unpredictable. It's a pretty good summary for the last year, probably. But being comfortable and coherent doesn't make the stories any more accurate or any less flawed. And that's a problem because, as Daniel Kahneman wrote in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, flawed stories of the past shape our views of the world and our expectations of the future. So the problem here isn't so much that we craft flawed stories. We're all going to do that. The problem is that once those flawed stories are written, we cling to them. Countless studies reveal that once we fix a story in our minds, we not only avoid information that contradicts the story, but we cling tightly to our version of reality when confronted by contradictory evidence. When the Buddha said our life is a creation of the mind, I'm pretty sure he meant it as a warning. But it's also an opportunity if we're willing to seize it. Think of it this way. We get annoyed or even angry when other people don't follow our script. Now, we may not even know we have a script. That's the way our brain works. But we are spinning out these stories all the time, writing the script of the way we think things should go, are going to go. But we forget that those other people who aren't following the script, they don't even think they're in our story. We're in theirs. And frankly, sometimes they're not all that sure how or why we got cast. It's hard not to be the star, to not center ourselves in every story we're in. I mean, because literally we always see the world from our own point of view. But if Shakespeare is right, and all the world's a stage, and all of the men and women mere players, then to share the stage, to live with other people, we have to fade into the background sometimes. Realize we may just be playing a supporting role in someone else's story. Or just a bit part. Maybe we're just an extra, a walk-on. We might not even be that. For some stories, our role may not be on stage at all. Our role is in the audience, to witness somebody else's story. And that can be hard, to take ourselves out of the story altogether, or to let go of the version of the story we've already written, and to just take in another human being's story the way they understand it, the way they see it, even if it contradicts our own vision of the world. To reconsider our own story in the light of what we learn from theirs. To be open to the possibility that we need to edit, to revise, to rethink the roles, maybe even our own role. And is not the dragon the hero of his own story? The gray-suited man asked in this morning's reading. Well, what if we find out we're the dragon in someone else's story? And what if their version of the story turns out to be closer to factual truth, to be more complete, to be more factually accurate than the one we've been telling ourselves all along? Well, sometimes that's going to kind of suck. And I think that may be a partial explanation for the written report written by the officers who killed George Floyd a year ago. Reverend Laura mentioned this in her newsletter article. The report was titled, "Man Dies After Medical Incident During Police Interaction." Now, one explanation for the, let's call it a disconnect between that summary and what most of us saw play out over 9 minutes of video is that the officers just plain lied when they wrote the report. And it would be easy to go with that explanation, to tell a single story about those 4 men based on those 9 minutes. But there's another explanation. That is the story as it played through those officers' lenses. They weren't the dragon. In their story, they might be the knights. Now, that doesn't make their story true, of course. It doesn't justify killing a man. But if they were the heroes of their story, it does tell us something about them. And More importantly, if we're honest, it can tell us something about ourselves. Now, we don't have to accept their version of the story, their story as true, to accept that it is their narrative. And to see that if they could deceive themselves, cast themselves as possibly the hero in that terrible story, then we might do something similar ourselves. I mean, not kill a man, but cause hurt. Leave hurt untended while spinning a story that justifies our actions as necessary or right or even heroic, and then lash out in defensive anger when confronted with a different narrative. And that's the bad seed from this morning's story. And it can just as easily be all of us. I all but guarantee every one of us has done it to people we love, not to mention people we barely know. I know I have. After Floyd's murder last summer, Twitter, Facebook, political speeches, they all rang out declaring, "This isn't who we are." Because that's the story we've told ourselves as individuals and as a nation. And we're wrong. As a nation, it is who we are. And as individuals, we are also the people who sometimes hurt those we love or ignore people who need us. We may not want to be those people. I think none of us want to be those people. I don't want to be that person. I worship in this church because I believe in love as a fundamental pillar of faith. But Thich Nhat Hanh teaches we must always remember that love is none other than understanding. I think that includes understanding the flaws in the stories we tell ourselves and about each other. We opened this morning with words from James Baldwin. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. Listening to the story of the bad seed this morning, I wondered what caused him to face who he was and to try to make those changes. And what I like about the story is it wasn't that he just completely turned into a different person or seed. It's that he made some changes but stayed flawed. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. I don't promise that seeing the flaws in our stories will make us the people we want to be, at least not completely. But if we don't face those flaws, our stories can never change. And so my question for you this morning is this. As a community or individually, what stories do you think you need to rewrite, or we as a nation or as a church community need to rewrite to become who we hope to be? And just as we did with the joys and sorrows, if you have an answer to that question or thoughts on any of this, please raise your hand, wave vigorously, type something in comments, and we will call on you.
Janice, I see your hand. You can go ahead.
I'm Janice, and I have been deeply moved by this morning's service. And I appreciate everything that both you and Amy have said. And I really, truly, honestly believe that what you've presented today is something that everybody needs to listen to. Because of your vulnerability in talking about this issue, And the way you have put the whole thing together, it's just, as I've said, been deeply moving for me this morning. And I wish everybody could hear this.
Thank you, Janice.
I think I see Marilyn.
This is Marilyn. And one of the things I struggle with, and this sermon today really brings it to the forefront again, is not being the star, and being a part of the audience. And I struggle with that every day. And just how you expanded it into what you've said today, as Janice said, I second motion. Deeply moving, and thank you.
Pamela writes in the chat, what a fantastic message. It has really made me think. This isn't something new, but you said it in a way that really made me think. It resonated. I want my friends and family to hear this.
Jamie has something.
And Gary.
I saw Gary first, so let's start with Gary.
Yeah, as you may know, I actually belong to a different faith community, but I like to join you folks when I can because I do feel at home with you. And I certainly plan on sharing this as soon as it's available, not only with Holy Presence, the old Catholic church that I belong to, our community, but also with, I have a Saturday morning coffee club of about 7 different couples that we've been meeting with for like 25 years. And I know that they will definitely want to see and hear this. So thanks so much. And, I think the one that got to me was, Chad, when you said that, and you may not even be in the story. And it's like, I don't mind being a bit player, but dang, I want to be in the story.
It's especially hard for us theater folks, Gary.
Jamie, go ahead.
Thank you. Well, my line of work has some similarities with Chad's, and as a social worker. And one of the things that I must do to gain somebody's trust and confidence is accept their point of view and acknowledge and validate it. And that can happen very quickly, or it can take a lot more time. But to be able to move on to a different place, to help them get to a place where they can see other possibilities, take other actions, and not solely focus on their own point of view, which may be very unhealthy. That is the first essential step. So in in terms of church, we've talked about radical hospitality and how we have to accept people who come to our church with their own points of view and their own take on things, and to have and to not just expect that we will expect them to conform to us. So I think that I need to continue to think about that, as do other members of our church. And that takes a little brain shift, I think.
Leslie writes in the chat, I thought the point that it's important to listen to other people's story instead of assuming you know what it is was very important. I actually have a thought, with the question about what story needs to change that Chad asked. One that I've been thinking about since I read the book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States, or something along those lines, is really the origin myth of the United States that gets repeated as these freedom-seeking people that left the the heavy hand of a government and came to a new world to flourish. And depending on your perspective, that story could look something more like a settler colonialism that exacted a genocide in order to inhabit a previously inhabited land. And there are probably other stories. I know there's a couple other versions of that book from other perspectives that are historically not perspectives we hear. And I think the origin myth of the US is so strong, and one that I think folks often want to emulate, and to treat it as more than a myth, I think, is awfully risky.
Well, and the tricky thing is that, and I'm not sure that this is a great example because there is so much myth wrapped up in the US origin story, but two versions of the story can be true at the same time in some contexts. I am not. Oh,
I see Reverend
Laura
Laura
waving. You're muted, Reverend Laura.
But I don't hear Reverend Laura.
I was just going to follow up on Ben, because I think both the story of the United States, is wrapped up in a myth, and the story of Unitarian Universalism, because we are seen as coming over with the Pilgrims and, seeking religious freedom. And I remember doing a tour in Boston with Unity Church Unitarian about UU history, and we started actually in a kind of the living history Indian encampment kind of place where folks had been when the Pilgrims had come over. And oh my God, from the moment I started that tour, I felt uncomfortable because all of the pieces started to come together in a very visceral way. So I feel grateful that we live in a time where stories that I know I was not personally taught are coming to the forefront, both about our faith and about America and about people of color in America. So I feel really grateful and humbled at the same time. Thanks so much, Chad.
And I mean, as I wrote this, the story of white supremacy was prominent in my mind, both within our faith and the struggle we've had, because the story we've told ourselves as a faith is that we're the good liberals. And maybe we are, but we don't want to confront what we haven't done, and our failings up to this, and frankly, some of the things we have done in our history. But it's also the story of the struggle that we keep having as a country to be what we think we are or what we want to be. I see that Pam posted a request for the link. I will make sure that we can get that out to everybody. If you search for The Danger of a Single Story, it will also come up. And I do recommend the entire TED Talk. That was just about 2 or 3 minutes of a 20-minute talk. She's amazing.
And can I just add a little layer of complexity to her? Because I think that I love that TED Talk video. And there was a lot of chatter on the minister's Facebook page yesterday because she's come out quite anti-trans, which probably is due to, think of where she comes from. But it's just interesting to add that layer, because there was a lot of discussion about, do you use a video of someone who is causing harm to certain groups? But I would kind of harken back to your story about the police officers. And, I also believe greatly in change, that folks start someplace and continue to change. But I like to add the tension around that as well.
Well, yeah, stories are complex.
Chad, I'm not seeing any other hands.
All right. Well, thank you all for your comments. We will now sing together apart.